From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I decided rather than terminating NAFTA, which would be a pretty big, shock to the system, we will renegotiate.
The Trump administration's released their plans to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement. They look surprisingly like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump withdrew from in one of his first acts as president. As the White House kicks off its Made in America week, labor leaders say the new NAFTA plan worsens protections for workers and would be the ultimate in hypocrisy. We'll speak with Public Citizen's Lori Wallach. Then, at any cost, the civilian catastrophe in West Mosul, Iraq. Amnesty International says the U.S. coalition may have committed war crimes there.
On the one hand, ISIS was systematically moving thousands of civilians into the fighting, and then they trapped them there. And then on the other hand, Iraqi and coalition forces bombarded these same areas with a relentless series of attacks that killed and injured thousands of civilians.
We'll speak with the researcher behind the report, then life on parole.
With unprecedented access to parolees and their supervisors.
No matter about your family member? I only care about you.
You don't care about me.
I'm in charge of your supervision.
So say that. Don't say you care about me. And the make or break relationships between them.
Do you understand what you've done? Seriously, I'm here trying to save your ass, but I don't know if you understand what you've done.
Some people think that being on parole is you're free. You're not.
As more states try to reduce their prison populations by putting more people on early release, the New York Times and Frontline profile 4 former prisoners as they navigate the challenges of their first year on parole. We'll meet some of them and speak with the director and reporter behind the documentary airing on PBS tonight. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Senate Republican plan to replace and repeal the Affordable Care Act has once again collapsed for now. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell made the announcement Monday night. Republicans' inability to push through their health care plan is a major defeat for the party, which controls the House, the Senate, and the presidency. On Monday night, Republican Senators Jerry Moran of Kansas and Mike Lee of Utah announced they would not support the latest Senate version of the bill, ensuring Republicans would not have enough votes to pass it. Their announcement came at the same time President Trump, who has heavily backed the Senate bill, was meeting with 7 Republican senators who did support the legislation. Later Monday night, President Trump tweeted, quote, "Republicans should just repeal failing Obamacare now and work on a new health care plan that will start from a clean slate. Dems will join in," unquote. The legislation would cut $700 billion from Medicaid. It faced opposition from all Senate Democrats, a slew of governors from both parties, the majority of the healthcare industry, the American Medical Association, hospitals, doctors, nurses, patient advocacy groups, and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he'll now try to push through legislation to repeal the Affordable Care Act and wait until after the 2018 midterm elections to propose a replacement. The director of the Office of Government Ethics, Walter Shaub, Jr., says the Trump administration has so undermined ethical standards that the United States is, quote, pretty close to a laughing stock at this point, unquote. Shaub is resigning today. He's been critical of President Trump on a slew of issues, including Trump's failure to release his tax returns, his refusal to sell his assets, and his frequent visits to his golf courses, which Shaub says, quote, create the appearance of profiting from the presidency, unquote. In his interview with the New York Times, Shaub also criticized Democrats for trying to co-opt his work, saying, quote, I don't like the fair weather friends who are supportive of the ethics program only as a political tool against this present administration, unquote. The White House has released its plans for renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement, known as NAFTA. The 17-page document says the White House seeks to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with Mexico and restrict the amount of imported material and goods that qualify under the agreement. Labor leaders and worker rights organizations criticize the plan, saying it resembles the sweeping Trans-Pacific Partnership. That trade deal faced years of global public resistance by those who said the free trade deal benefited corporations at the expense of worker rights and health and environmental regulations. Trump withdrew the U.S. from the TPP in one of his first acts as president. The release of the NAFTA renegotiation plan Monday came as Trump kicked off his Made in America-themed week. The vast majority of Trump's own company's products are manufactured overseas. We'll have more on NAFTA after headlines with Lori Wallach of Public Citizen. The United Nations is urging the Iraqi government to stop collective punishment against civilians accused of having had ties to ISIS. The UN says family members of ISIS militants are facing forced displacement, the confiscation of their homes, and the fear of retribution. This is Suhaib, whose husband joined ISIS.
In the beginning, he had faith in them, but later he realized he was wrong when he saw the Islamic State militants withdrawing from East Mosul after they had said that they would not have left and that the Iraqi forces could not recapture the areas. He felt their injustice and he regretted his decision. But he could not leave because they executed anyone who would have left them, even if it was a child. I have not heard from him for 2 months now. I do not know if he is buried under the rubble.
This comes as Amnesty International says the U.S.-led coalition and the U.S.-backed Iraqi forces violated international law and may have committed war crimes during the battle to seize control of Mosul from ISIS. We'll speak with the Amnesty International researcher later in the broadcast. In a surprise move, South Korea has reached out to North Korea with an offer to hold military talks this Friday at the demilitarized zone between the two countries. The U.S., Japan, and the European Union, on the other hand, are pushing for heavier sanctions against North Korea. The South Korea overture comes as South Korea refused to allow peace activist Christine An, who was born in South Korea, into the country, where she was slated to meet with women's peace groups. South Korea said she'd been denied entry on the ground she might, quote, hurt the national interests and public safety, unquote. This is Christine An speaking earlier this month on Democracy Now! About the prospects for de-escalating tensions between South and North Korea and the United States.
Right now, the most viable proposal that is on the table that has now, as you mentioned earlier, is backed by both China and Russia, but it originally came from the North Koreans in 2015, was to halt the U.S. and South Korean military exercises in exchange for freezing North Korea's nuclear and long-range missile program. Now, that is a deal that should be seriously considered, but the Trump administration is not accepting it.
In Gaza, Israeli-imposed restrictions on electricity continue to limit electricity to barely 2 hours a day amidst the stifling summer heat, making it impossible to sleep or keep food from spoiling. The United Nations has warned Gaza has become unlivable for its 2 million residents. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Israeli security forces attacked Palestinians with stun grenades Monday amidst protests and clashes around the Al-Aqsa compound. Over the weekend, Israel installed metal detectors and closed-circuit televisions at the entrance of the holy site, drawing widespread condemnation and protests by Palestinians. In Japan, a top official with the Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO, says he wants to dump more than 700,000 tons of contaminated water from Fukushima's nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean. Local fishermen are protesting against the plan, saying dumping more radioactive waste into the water will imperil the fishing industry. The water's contaminated with tritium, which can cause cancer when ingested in high concentrations. Back in the United States and Texas, white former Balch Springs police officer Roy Oliver has been indicted by a grand jury for the murder of 15-year-old African-American student Jordan Edwards earlier this year. Police body cam video shows Officer Oliver fired his assault rifle into a car carrying 5 black teenagers as they drove away from the officer. One of the car's passengers says the officer never even ordered the boys to stop driving before opening fire. Meanwhile, in Minneapolis, hundreds of people attended a vigil and rally Sunday to demand justice for Justine Damond, who was killed by a police officer Saturday after she called 911 to report what she thought was a sexual assault occurring near her home. Damond, who is a white Australian woman, was planning to marry her fiancé next month. She was reportedly wearing her pajamas and was in the alleyway outside her apartment when she was shot by Officer Mohammed Noor as she approached the police car. Officer Noor and his partner's body cameras were not on at the time. This is Justine Damond's father.
We thought yesterday was our worst nightmare, But we awoke to the ugly truth, and it hurt even more. Justine, our daughter, was so special to us and to so many others. We went down to Freshy Beach this morning and saw the blackness change to light. Justine was a beacon to all of us. We only ask that the light of justice shine down on the circumstances of her death. Thank you.
And tens of thousands of people may have their student debt erased as private creditors are realizing they don't actually have the paperwork required to prove they own the loans. As much as $5 billion of student debt is at stake in the ongoing legal battles, which centers on national collegiate student loan trusts. Dozens of students have already had lawsuits against them dismissed. Amidst revelations, National Collegiate Student Loan Trusts had mass-produced documentation and kept incomplete records. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today with Monday's highly anticipated release of the Trump administration's goals for renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico. The 17-page document outlines Trump's plans to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with Mexico and eliminate a controversial dispute settlement mechanism. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer said, quote, "Too many Americans have been hurt by closed factories, exported jobs, and broken political promises." And he vowed to negotiate a, quote, "fair deal." Trade analysts say the plan is vague and sounds a lot like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a 12-country trade deal that included Canada and Mexico. On the campaign trail, Trump called the TPP, quote, "a continuing rape of our country." He then withdrew the U.S. from the deal in one of his first acts as president. Meanwhile, labor leaders criticized the new NAFTA plan, saying it worsens protections for workers. AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka said, quote, "Small changes around the edges or the insertion of disastrous Trans-Pacific Partnership provisions are not acceptable and would be the ultimate in hypocrisy."
The release of the NAFTA renegotiation plan comes as the White House kicks off its Made in America-themed week. Speaking Monday, Trump lashed out against trade deals he said have hurt U.S. companies.
I want to make a pledge to each and every one of you. No longer are we going to allow other countries to break the rules, steal our jobs, and drain our wealth. And it has been drained. It has been drained.
Trump campaigned on the promise of either leaving NAFTA or renegotiating the agreement. In April, he said the U.S. will remain and seek to renegotiate using fast-track authority, which mandated Monday's release of detailed objectives 30 days prior to the beginning of formal talks. Trump will now have sweeping authority to independently broker an agreement before submitting it to Congress for a vote. For more, we're joined by Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch and author of The Rise and Fall of Fast-Track Trade Authority. Lori, welcome back to Democracy Now! So tell us what is in these plans that were released yesterday by the Trump administration and why labor leaders are so skeptical of what the Trump administration has proposed.
Well, the document that came out yesterday certainly doesn't describe the revolutionary transformation of the NAFTA into something that's much better for working Americans, which is what President Trump promised as a candidate. On the other hand, the document is fairly vague. And I think there are a couple of different reasons for that being the case, but it remains really unclear from this document if, on the one hand, some real improvements might be in the offing relative to the current agreement, or, looking at this document, you could go either way, a lot of what was in the Trans-Pacific Partnership is going to get added on to the existing NAFTA. The bad stuff is not going to get cut, and as a result, the agreement's going to be worse for people and the planet in all three countries. And there's enough vagueness in the descriptions that it's unclear if the things that simply must be done, and there is a short list of them that must be done, if we are going to reduce the offshoring of U.S. jobs, the pressure downward on wages in all the countries. The language is so vague, it's not clear they're doing that, But on the other hand, the language is so vague, it's unclear exactly what, say, the labor and environmental standards will be.
And Laurie, clearly one of the goals would be to reduce the trade deficit between the U.S. especially and Mexico. But also there's all this stuff about currency manipulation. I don't think anyone's ever accused Canada or Mexico of being involved in currency manipulation. Could you talk about those two aspects?
Well, it is super interesting, and it really is the first time the U.S. trade agreement has listed as its objective bringing down the trade deficit. So when President Trump was a candidate, he talked about making NAFTA much better for working Americans, and he described what that would mean as bringing down the trade deficit, which was $173 billion of goods trade deficit with Mexico and Canada last year. And he said he would make sure that more jobs were created by renegotiating. So on the one hand, it's pretty interesting, and it's never been the case, that an explicit goal of the negotiations is to try and get the trade more in balance. And that's actually a good thing. The flip side of that is it's unclear whether the objectives will deliver on that. Now, the fact that that's the goal, and the guy who's the trade representative has actually been a guy who has consistently fought for U.S. companies and U.S. workers. He's a guy who I'm hopeful about his USTR. That makes you wonder if what the vagueness is about. Are there still things they haven't decided in the administration? Maybe he's just being smart and avoiding picking a big fight on some of the issues that could make it better. Who knows? But the currency stuff is interesting because actually, in fact, right after NAFTA went into effect, Mexico devalued its currency enormously, the peso crisis, and actually that wiped out all of the benefits of the tariff cuts. So the devaluation was bigger than the average drop in tariffs that the U.S. products had faced. So we basically eliminated any of the benefits with that. And I think part of the reason, and the trade representative said this, they're going to do the currency language in this agreement is to set a model so that it's a basic element of every U.S. agreement, which is not a bad thing. The thing that is disappointing is that in order to bring down the trade deficit and to create more manufacturing jobs in the U.S., to counter the race to the bottom, there are a set of things you simply have to do. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican or from Mars. These are the only things that are going to change the numbers. And in that, getting rid of the incentives that exist in NAFTA, investor protections to offshore jobs, getting rid of the ban on buy local and buy American, which offshores our tax dollars instead of reinvesting them to create jobs at home, putting in environmental, labor, and wage standards that are strong and real, not the fluff from TPP, and enforcing them. So you actually have to meet the standards before you get the benefits of the agreement. Those kinds of real changes, the document yesterday is not clear about. I wouldn't totally say that none of that's going to happen, but also it's a little worrying that it's not necessarily going to happen. And in fact, is Buy American week? And the language on the Buy American procurement issues was particularly disappointing. It doesn't get rid of NAFTA's ban that's in place now on Buy American and Buy Local. And that seems pretty hypocritical.
Speaking of Buy America Week, during a press briefing Monday, a reporter asked Press Secretary Sean Spicer if Made in America Week will apply to Trump brands manufactured internationally.
I'm wondering whether you can tell us if Made in America Week will include the Trump Organization or Ivanka Trump brands committing to stop manufacturing wares abroad.
I'm sorry, if
this, as part of Made in America Week, if the Trump Organization or Ivanka Trump's brands will make any kind of commitment to stop manufacturing gifts, clothes, and other wares abroad.
So there's a couple things that are interesting about that question. First, I think what's really important is the president's agenda, regulatory relief and tax relief, are focused on trying to make sure that all companies can hire here, can expand here, can manufacture here. That's something that he wants for every company, and you've seen him talk about that extensively. With respect to his own companies, obviously it's inappropriate to discuss how anything would affect their own companies. But I can tell you that in some cases, there are certain supply chains or scalability that may not be available in this country. I'm not going to comment on specific products, but I will tell you that the overall arching goal, of course, though, is to grow manufacturing, to grow investment here in the United States, and to grow U.S. workers here. So that remains the overall objective.
So that was Sean Spicer. We couldn't show you video because, once again, for at least 8 days now, the Trump administration has not allowed video to be shown of the press briefing at the White House. But that's Sean Spicer responding to the question about whether Made in America should apply to Trump brands. Lori Wallach.
Well, it raises, not just is that a very important question, but it raises a very important problem with these NAFTA renegotiations, which is the president's refused to divest his business interests. He's refused to disclose what his full investments are in Mexico and Canada. So when these talks are ongoing, and they can start in 30 days, even though we don't have the details of what's going to be demanded, what the opening U.S. documents are, a lot of members of Congress have demanded the Trump administration simply do what the European Union does, which is before it officially tables a document making demands of another country in a trade negotiation, they publish them publicly. So with this investment in Mexico, investment in Canada, Ivanka's making goods in Mexico, some of the Donald Trump clothing line was made in Mexico, the really direct conflict of interest about in whose interest some of these negotiations will happen. So I respect and trust the guy who's the United States Trade Representative, but he's part of a big administration that includes those conflicts of interest with the Trump organization. That includes the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who was the head of a company that has used the investor state corporate tribunals, which this document does not make clear we're getting rid of in these renegotiations. In fact, oil and gas companies are the ones who are using this mechanism where multinational corporations are empowered to attack governments in front of tribunals of 3 trade attorneys who can order us taxpayers to pay unlimited sums, including for the company's lost expected future profits, if the companies think that some domestic environmental health, consumer law undermines their NAFTA privileges. And in NAFTA, this is not hypothetical. Like, the reason why the environmental, labor, consumer groups say NAFTA needs a total redo simply to stop the damage is already $470 million has been paid out to multinational corporations in NAFTA investor state attacks on mining rules, toxics bans, water and timber policies. So just to stop those corporate attacks, to stop the ongoing offshoring. I mean, if you want to talk about the Trump trade hypocrisy, put your head around this one. Remember, everyone heard him say, I'm going to make companies at offshore jobs suffer. And he threatened Carrier. Don't you take those jobs out of Indiana and over to Mexico. Well, Carrier's offshoring 1,200 of the 2,000 jobs. So has anything happened to them? Oh, yes. Not a punishment, but 15 new lucrative government contracts since the Trump administration. So there are, I would say, deep politics and conflicts in that administration on not just the Buy America Week, but what happens with the NAFTA renegotiations that make the concerns about in whose interest, what's actually going to be on the table, very real. And on that note, I would say a lot of folks are going to see their members of Congress in August and should talk to them about making sure NAFTA is either replaced or we get out of it.
Lori, quickly, if you could, where do we go from here? Is there a time limit? There are reports that Republicans want to get a deal wrapped up by the beginning of next year?
So the goal is to try and finish negotiations at the end of the year. I don't think that's actually feasible. The way Fast Track works, they can start the talks as soon as August 16th. And that's why I was saying during August recess, when your members of Congress are home for 5 weeks, it's totally worth at a Labor Day picnic or parade, or if you happen to run into them at some event, to grab your members of Congress' hands, say, I'm really concerned about this NAFTA renegotiation. Can you stay on top of that? Will you promise me you'll oppose any agreement, say, that still has investor state dispute settlement in it? If that's in there, obviously it's not a good trade agreement for people. It's just a good trade agreement for corporations. So that process of when it gets decided and when it gets finished is going to depend on us. If we basically insist on holding accountable Trump to his promises to make it really better for people, not just corporations, it could stretch out.
Lori Wallach, I want to thank you for being with us, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, author of The Rise and Fall of Fast Trade. Trade Authority. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll go to Beirut, Lebanon, to look at a new amnesty report. Is the U.S. coalition committing war crimes in Mosul, Iraq? Stay with us.
French bistro, Dominican chef, Italian restaurant, Boricua chef, Chinese takeout, Mexican chef, New for America, but to the end of that is a French bistro, Dominican chef, Italian restaurant, Boricua chef, Chinese takeout, Mexican chef, New for America, but to the end of that. Brown walks your baby, brown walks your dog, brown raised America, place of its mom, brown cleans your house, brown takes the trash, brown even wipes your granddaddy. Brown sews the buttons back on your shirt, brown picks the food, brown put it in the dirt, brown drives your bus, brown drives your taxi, brown brings your lunch and a bike when you're relaxing. I want it all now, want it all now. We build the ghettos and we tear them down. Brown lays bricks, brown builds your wall, brown tears them down and builds them again. Brown breaks his back, brown takes the flag, brown gets cut 'cause his papers are whack, brown sits down.
Mexican Chef by Zini Rubinos here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the journalistic monitoring group Air Wars is reporting that the U.S.-led war against ISIS has killed at least a dozen civilians every single day since President Trump took office. Their investigation found U.S.-led coalition airstrikes and shelling in Iraq and Syria killed more than 2,200 civilians during Trump's 6 months in office, a far higher rate of reported civilian casualties than under the Obama administration.
This comes as Amnesty International reports the U.S.-led coalition and the U.S.-backed Iraqi forces violated international law and may have committed war crimes during the battle to seize control of Mosul from ISIS. Lieutenant General Stephen Townsend, who oversees the campaign against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, has denied the U.S.-led coalition broke international law, claiming instead the campaign against ISIS is the, quote, most precise campaign in the history of warfare, unquote. Thousands of civilians were killed during the 9-month battle in Mosul, and nearly 1 million residents were forced to flee their homes. For more, we go to Beirut, Lebanon, to speak with Nicolette Waldman, an Iraq researcher at Amnesty International, co-author of their new report, At Any Cost, the Civilian Catastrophe in West Mosul, Iraq. Nicolette, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what you found.
Thank you. What we found is that both ISIS and the Iraqi coalition forces inflicted massive harm on civilians during the battle for West Mosul. On the one hand, ISIS systematically moved thousands of civilians directly into areas of active fighting, and then they trapped them there. On the other hand, Iraqi and coalition forces then subjected these very same areas to relentless attacks. These attacks used explosive and imprecise weapons that killed and injured thousands of civilians and left the city flattened.
And Nicolette, were you able to interview people in both East and West Mosul? And what were some of the things that they told you directly, the civilians trapped in these zones?
This report focused only on the battle for West Mosul, and we had covered the battle in East Mosul in previous outputs, but this report really focused in on the battle that took place between February and then just ended officially days ago. And for this research, we visited West Mosul, we visited East Mosul, and then we talked to people in camps around the city who had fled either days or weeks before we spoke with them. And what they told us was that this battle was horrific. Basically, they had been rounded up and forced into the battle, and then they had no way out. And what actually happened for so many people is that because they were forced to move into the city, and then as the battle continued, they were forced to fall back. So as the front lines went back, the civilians moved back with those front lines. And the area in West Mosul became increasingly packed with civilians. So because ISIS was preventing people from escaping, this meant that they only had one way out in most cases, and that was directly through the front lines of the battle. And what people told us time and time again is that they didn't wait for the battle to subside or the fighting to calm down. Instead, they waited for the fighting to actually reach its peak. And that was the moment when they ran out into the middle of the street, usually. They would sit down, they would raise their hands, and they would say civilians, families, and sit and wait for the Iraqi forces to motion them forward. Only then would they literally make a run for it and make it out of this battle. So the cost to civilians was extremely high. And really what we want to do with this report is to bring attention not to the victory that so many are talking about in the last few days, but to the tremendous cost that civilians suffered during this battle.
Speaking to NPR Thursday, Air Force Brigadier General Andrew Croft responded to the findings of your report, of the Amnesty report.
I think it's an unfair accusation. They have not coordinated with the coalition. I'll tell you that from the way we do our airstrikes, we use the most precise and discriminate weapons that we can ever use and are available in the world to avoid targeting civilians. And I'll tell you, if there's ever a doubt of whether or not there's a civilian involved, we will not strike. And so this is the most precision, low collateral level of warfare, especially in an urban environment like this, which has not been seen since World War II, that you could ever construct. And so we have done, in my view, the absolute best job we can to avoid any civilian casualties. They're going to happen just based on the nature of the war, but I can tell you that to be effective, we've got to support the Iraqi security forces, and that's what we've done.
Nicolette Waldman, can you respond to Air Force Brigadier General Andrew Croft?
That is not what we found on the ground. And basically, we spent weeks sitting with families, talking to them, and it seemed as if, to me, every third family we talked to had lost a family member in one of these Iraqi and coalition Air Force airstrikes or ground attacks. And it was actually so common for people to be full of shrapnel. I met whole families who were full of shrapnel that they wouldn't even seek medical attention. So to his claims that this was the most precise campaign in the history of warfare, I would respond just with my experience, with the civilians' experience of what they went through, and basically would call on the Iraqi and coalition air forces to use their great technological advantages to better protect civilians in places such as West Mosul, because what we found was quite the contrary. We found that Iraqi forces in particular were consistently using IRAMs, improvised rocket-assisted munitions. These are basically flying IEDs. They have a massive warhead, and they cannot be precisely targeted. So these were being flung into neighborhoods where people were trapped, where they had no way out, and where often people were packed in one house between groups between 15 and 100 civilians. So when this type of imprecise, these weapons that cannot be targeted are launched into areas like this, the cost is going to be high. And we would call on the US and Iraq coalition, the coalition and Iraqi forces, to do better in the future, to prioritize civilian protection, and to uphold their obligations under an international humanitarian law, which requires them not to use the type of weapons they did, these imprecise explosive weapons, in these very densely populated areas.
And what did you find out about the reports from the coalition forces that ISIS was using civilians as human shields? How prevalent was that from what you were able to find out?
It was absolutely prevalent, and to a scale even we didn't expect. What was happening is they weren't just using humans as shields to protect their own forces. They were moving people in to the battle. So starting in even the months before the battle for West Mosul started, they rounded up civilians in buses, in trucks, and forced them sometimes to move by foot by the thousands. So they moved them into West Mosul. Then once they were there, they moved them back and kept them with them from neighborhood to neighborhood. So this could have been one of the most prevalent use of human shields or using civilians just to protect their own forces in modern history. And what happened then as well is they didn't just put them into this amazing risk. They kept them there so that people who would try to escape and save their own lives would be executed by snipers as they were running to safety, and then the bodies of these people would be hung by ISIS in public areas as a warning for those who might just consider trying to escape. So this meant that people could not escape, and in some cases, not just here or there, but again and again, we heard that people were being welded into their houses. So the front doors were actually being welded together. We heard that people had booby traps set in the exits of their houses so they could not leave. This meant that huge groups of civilians were sheltering in these homes and being used as human shields in such an egregious way, in a deliberate way. But then what was happening is these very same areas where these people were trapped, these areas were being barraged by air attacks and ground attacks by the Iraqi and coalition forces. And what we found was that most attacks weren't actually killing the high numbers of attacks like the Mosul al-Jadida attack on March 17th. Instead, they were killing between 1 and 20 civilians. And most of these deaths will actually go unnoticed and so far have not been acknowledged because actually in Mosul, in West Mosul, ISIS had completely banned the use of mobile phones, and they don't have the kind of infrastructure to rescue people, to actually go after and document these deaths. So what we found when we were doing this research is that the scale of death was much, much higher than has so far been acknowledged. And Air Wars, who you mentioned just at the beginning of your show, estimated that between just February 2017 and June 2017, as many as 6,800 people were killed in attacks by the Iraqi and coalition forces. And just during our research, so during the 151 interviews that we conducted with West Mosul residents, we documented 45 unlawful attacks. And these attacks killed at least 426 civilians and injured 100. So the scale of suffering, the scale of death and injury has really not been grappled with yet, and I'm afraid we'll be finding out in the months and the years to come of the true toll of this operation.
Nicolette Waldman, I want to thank you for being with us, Iraq researcher at Amnesty International, co-author of the new report, which we'll link to at any cost, the civilian catastrophe in West Mosul, Iraq. When we come back, Life on Parole, a new Frontline documentary that airs tonight on PBS, looking at how states are trying to reduce their prison population by putting more people on parole. We'll meet some of the former prisoners as they navigate challenges of their first year on parole and speak with the director and the New York Times reporter behind the story. Stay with us.
Where did all the blue skies go? Poison is the wind that blows from the north and south and east. Mercy, mercy me. Oh, things ain't what they used to be. Things ain't what they used to be. No. Oil's wasting on our oceans and upon our seas. Fish full of mercury. Mercy, mercy me. Oh, Lord, somebody help me. Things ain't what they used to be. No. Radiation underground and in the sky. Animals and birds that live nearby.
Myra Jones singing cover of Marvin Gaye's Mercy, Mercy Me. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We end today's show with a fascinating new collaboration between Frontline and the New York Times called Life on Parole that airs this evening on PBS.
Tonight on Frontline, hundreds of people are put on parole every day, and many of them wind up back behind bars.
It is not unusual for parolees to come back once or twice once they're out. They didn't commit a new crime, but they're violating the rules of their supervision.
Like right now, even going in this store, I can end up back in jail, and I'm only getting a coffee.
But many states are trying to break the cycle.
It's giving me every reason to lock him up, and I'm still working with him.
Really didn't know it was that serious, I thought.
It's extremely serious. You're also going on GPS today.
Filmed over a year and a half.
Why would you do this to somebody? So my life is pretty much ruined for the next 3 years.
With unprecedented access to parolees and their supervisors.
I only care about you.
You don't care about you.
I I'm in charge of your supervision.
I say that, mostly you care about me. And the make or break relationships between them.
Do you understand what you've done? Seriously, like, I'm here trying to save your ass, but I don't know if you understand what you've done.
Some people think that being on parole is you're free. You're not.
I have to believe that she is going to do good. I make a living on second chances.
Frontline Life on Parole was filmed in Connecticut, which, like many states, is trying to reduce its prison population by putting more people on early release. It follows 4 parolees and their parole officers as they navigate their first year out from behind bars and try not to violate their terms of release. Today, we'll meet some of them. We begin with Errol Brantley.
Just let him home. I've been waiting for this for too long. Open, open. When Errol was coming home, I was more than excited. We were waiting for him to get out on parole and to come home. When you love somebody and you want to make a future with them, you kind of feel like all that is on hold.
Errol Brantley is being released from prison early after serving 20 months for drug possession and burglary.
Oh my God. Hey, bitch, I like that they had a hug. I got a bunch of hugs from everybody.
To just be able to put your arms around somebody is a huge thing.
I gotta go to parole.
Do we know where that is?
100 Sheldon Street, Hartford, Connecticut.
I don't even feel like I woke up in prison this morning, you know? I've been coming to prison since 1999 now, and I've been in and out of jail 11 times. This time that I got out was the first time that I was on parole.
Brantley?
I was definitely frightened. I didn't know what to expect.
Released from Carl Robinson, correct? Parole sentence with like a little less than 4 years?
Errol's parole officer is Mark Paulich. He's been a parole officer for 18 years.
So what was your crime over there?
Burglary.
Burglary?
Yeah.
Is that kind of your thing, or?
No, not at all. I was for drugs.
All right, and drug of choice is?
Heroin.
Mr. Brantley, you can just read, had a long, long history of opiate addiction. And if you're in this business long enough, you know the chances are at some point it will rear its ugly head. So now he's on your watch. So you got to make sure you're dotting I's and crossing T's, that's for sure. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to have you review these conditions now. So what I need you to do is read everyone and make sure you understand each condition and then sign at the end.
Among the conditions of his release, Errol will have to undergo mandatory drug testing, and he's barred from contact with prior victims, which includes his girlfriend, Catherine.
I mean, is long-term planning with your mom at that address, or are you going to kind of look to get on your feet?
No, I want to go back home. I don't live with my mom. I actually live with my girlfriend,
That's
Catherine.
why I'm asking.
But there was a problem at the jail. They said that she was a victim, and they took her off of my visiting list after like 17 months.
Mm-hmm. Who's the person?
Catherine Eaton.
Well, was she a victim or not?
No, she wasn't.
What are they saying she was a victim of?
Burglary.
Did you ever burglarize your own house that she lived in? Did you ever?
Yeah, I took my TV to the pawn shop.
The Department of Corrections has a policy. When an offender is released, they can have no contact with previous crime victims or co-defendants. She called the police on him. She got him incarcerated and at least got him sober or cleaned up for a while, but she then created the situation in the department's eyes that she was a crime victim because he took her TV set. There's no staying overnight there. There's no nothing.
Yes.
Yeah, following you out.
Errol leaves and goes straight home with Catherine, violating the terms of his parole on his very first day.
I just wanted to stay close to the people that I loved and feel protected. And I understand that parole, that they have to do what they have to do. But I was happy. I was home. That's all I have up here. That's all I need.
Yeah, welcome home, absolutely. It's a good place to be. Been trying to get here for a long time.
That's Errol Brantley, one of the parolees featured in Life on Parole, a documentary by Frontline with the New York Times. It airs tonight at 10 p.m. local time and PBS stations around the country. You can also watch it online. For more, we're joined by Matthew O'Neill, who's the film's director, and by Shyla Dewan, the national criminal justice editor for the New York Times. Her related report on Errol is headlined, "She's His Rock. His parole officer won't let him see her." It's up now. In fact, it was the cover story of the Monday New York Times, or the top of the fold story. Quite an amazing front page, then full page spread, Shyla. This incredible dilemma for Errol, who comes out of jail, and he is not allowed to see his girlfriend, Catherine Eaton. If you can explain this further from what we watched and also in this piece.
Sure. I mean, he was actually told at his parole hearing, we won't list Catherine Eaton as one of your victims. The plan was for him to go back to living with her as he had been before he went to jail. And all of a sudden, they get told, you know what, she's a victim, she's showing up in the records, someone's going over the records, you can't do it, we're not gonna approve this plan. So the whole thing is thrown into turmoil, the thing they've been waiting for 2 years, and this is because of this phone call she made to the police in 2014 saying, my boyfriend's out of control, he needs help. She says that she made the call in order to force him basically into rehab. He's using heroin, he needs money, and he takes the TV.
And she was afraid he was going to be injured by the heroin that was laced.
That's right. Both of them know a lot of people who have OD'd on heroin, and they've had heroin deaths in their lives. So it's a reality to them that this can happen.
And how was it resolved eventually, or was it?
He was arrested. At the time, he was on probation, so he actually violated probation just by having her call the police. So he's arrested, but the charges that involved her being a victim, which is the theft of the television, were dropped. So there's never any ruling that he has victimized her. There was no violence in that incident, and he eventually is convicted of an unrelated break-in. And so that's what he is now on parole for.
And so it goes to this larger story of the state controlling. I mean, I'm sure all studies show when you go home to a solid home life, it's going to increase your chance that you won't return. You won't be a recidivist. And yet he is not only not allowed to live with her, but contact her in any way. The girlfriend who has written to him, visited him nonstop through his years in prison.
And you see a lot of these policies in criminal justice. I mean, just the fact that they make phone calls so expensive, or video calls, any kind of contact with prisoners so difficult, undermines this idea that strong family relationships are really the motivator to keep people from getting in trouble again.
Matthew, I wanted to ask you, we've all heard about the 2 million people in prison or in the jails across America, but not of the, is it 4.7 million that are on parole or on probation?
4.7 million on parole or probation, and the number of people who are on parole is actually growing as we lower the number of people who are incarcerated. And I think at this time, it's important that we look at the entirety of the criminal justice system, because as plays out in Errol's story, once the criminal justice system touches you or you touch it, it is very, very difficult to ever get unstuck. And you see these events chase people throughout their lives.
Why did you look at Connecticut?
Connecticut is a state that is trying to reform many aspects of its criminal justice system. And when we actually went there, we were really focused primarily on what happens after release. What are the challenges that people face when they're released from incarceration? And we quickly understood that parole plays a huge role in people's ability to succeed or the obstacles that they may face. And most people who are released from prison are released to the supervision of a parole officer. So these relationships were so central to the lives of everyone that we were following that we realized parole was something important to look at. And Connecticut is trying to change the way parole works. Traditionally, it was, if you make a mistake, we're going to throw the cuffs on you and bring you back into prison. And as you see play out in the film, parole officers are more and more being asked to play multiple roles, sort of prosecutor, investigator, as traditionally done, but also drug counselor, social worker, even housing advocate. And I think you begin to understand by seeing these otherwise invisible meetings, because parole officers have enormous control over the lives of the parolees, and very few people analyze that.
Well, let's go back to the film.
Sure.
I want to turn to the story of Jessica Proctor, another person that you featured in Life on Parole.
And there's fewer people being released from prison. If you're on parole, you're still sort of in the Department of Correction. You're being monitored in the community by a parole officer, but on any day, for any type of violation, they can take you directly back into prison because you're still technically serving your sentence, right? The parole board is making decisions.
Mike Lawler is one of the officials trying to turn this around and give parolees more chances once they're out.
It is not unusual for parolees to come back once or twice once they're out, right? They didn't commit a new crime, but they're violating the rules of their supervision.
One change has been the creation of a special unit devoted exclusively to the needs of women parolees. Officer Catherine Montoya helped start the unit.
Women are a different population. They have different needs. Their supervision needs to be different. My ladies oftentimes are the primary caretakers of their children. But then if they're not doing good, if I remove them from the situation, who's going to take care of those kids? So, you know, it's do a lot of thinking after hours, whether the decisions that I'm making are correct or not, so it's hard. So Jessica, I haven't met her yet, but I read her case. She came in when she was 18 years old. She's gonna be doing 5 years of parole with me. This is a pivotal time for her. She needs to make a decision right now, whether this is just a one-time deal that happened in her life and she's gonna move on from this, or whether she's gonna be a returning customer, someone that keeps coming in and out of the system.
I did 10 years. I was young. I was 18 years old. I don't think I should be on nobody else's supervision. I've been getting watched for 10 years, okay? People stripping me, all that. I've been through it. Like, I don't think that I need to be on nobody's parole.
Jessica Proctor went to prison for slashing another girl's face with a razor blade.
I didn't kill nobody, but you would have thought I did kill somebody, though. 10 years, 5 years parole. I think that was a little bit excessive. So I do hold some type of resentment.
She got out of prison 6 days ago. This is her first meeting with Officer Montoya.
So hi, Jessica. I'm Officer Montoya, your parole officer. That's everything. So when you come here, you have to clear the metal detector. A lot of people think that being on parole is like you're free. They're not free, but there's going to be a measure of freedom that is going to be afforded to you. We're going to be together for a while. It's going to be 5 years. We might not see eye to eye every single time, but the point is that we have to work together. And the better you and I get along, the chances are your supervision is going to be successful. Let's go pull a urine. Jessica was young, got in trouble, went to jail for a substantial amount of time, came back out. She really wants to reconnect with her son. That's one of her biggest goals in her life, to get her son back into her life, to be a mother to her son.
So this is Dante's bio mom, Jessica, my cousin. This is when she first went into prison. And look at this.
Jessica gave up custody of her son, Dante, and for now, they are not living together.
I think for a long time, he thought that I was his bio mom until my sister got pregnant. And he said, I was in your stomach like that. And I was like, no, Pop. No, Papa, you weren't in my stomach. You were in Mommy Jessica's stomach. And then from then on, I would just tell him that you're different than most kids, because most people only have one mom, and you have 3 moms.
When I was growing up, the only thing I really knew was, like, she was locked up. And I'm like, she's locked up. So when is she coming out? When can I see her?
Reconnecting with family is so difficult. Reunification with their kids. I always advocate for family counseling, for not only for the offender, but for as a family, everyone together, because there's a lot of hurt feelings, there's a lot of anger, and people don't have a lot of skills to be able to maintain a situation like that, so they'll go back to their behaviors, you know, which is like drinking or drug use.
So that was Jessica Proctor. Matthew, To what degree are the people that you filmed here reflect the general population that you were dealing with? Because obviously everyone was on camera, both the parole officers as well as those who were, the parolees, and so they're very aware of their situation and perhaps on their best behavior. I'm wondering if you got any other stories from the parolees about parole officers who weren't as nice on camera as they were during these interviews.
Well, I think you'll see in the film that people, both on the parole officer side and the parolees, are remarkably unguarded. And I think we see a lot of those relationships exactly as they play out. Because we were there so consistently, we were in every parole meeting we could have access to. We were with the people we were following on the streets, in their homes, at their place of work when we could. And we became very much part of the fabric of their lives. So I think you'll see in this film things that if you were trying to perform for the cameras, you wouldn't put on camera if you were a parole officer or a parolee.
Shyla Dewan, one of the pieces that's upcoming in the Times is about Rob, who is on parole. We don't have time to play the clip of him, but can you talk about the challenges he faced and what this says about the parole system, which increasingly people are on?
Rob is a guy who, when you look at his life story, he's the child of an addict. There's addiction and death from addiction throughout his family tree. And you just kind of look and go, were you destined for institutionalization in a way? Like, how would you not have had this life trajectory? And when we tried to quantify that in a way by giving some of our parolees a survey that ranks childhood trauma from 1 to 10, and 4 is considered a high score, and Rob scores a 9 on that. So we really trying to pick apart this cycle, because Rob has children, including one young child, and we're trying to look at how this cycle perpetuates itself and how it can be interrupted in Rob's case, because we now have many, many children of opiate addicts, and this is going to be an increasing issue.
And what most surprised you in the time you spent on this story?
I think one of Matt's takeaways was one of the most surprising things is that he said to me, you know, the people we are following who had the longest sentences, like Jessica, are the people who are doing the best now. And it makes you wonder whether short prison sentences even make any sense, or if there should be another approach, a different kind of intensive, individualized approach.
What do you mean? Whether short? What do you mean that whether short prison sentences?
It was surprising because we talk a lot about how long our sentences are in this country and how over incarcerated we are compared to other places. But just to hear that, you know, spending a long time in prison gives you, when you come out, a sort of more determination and tools to do better is a little surprising. So then you have to think about, well, what about those short sentences? Do they do any good at all? Spending a year in prison.
And Matt, you did both those who were on parole and probation. For those who are not familiar with the criminal justice system, what's the difference, and was there any difference in the outcomes?
Well, there's when you talk about the criminal justice system, it's very hard to make generalizations, because in the United States we're really talking about, and I'm stealing one of Shyla's lines here, 50 different criminal justice systems, because each state is complicated, and the way they run parole and the way they run probation are very, very different. In our particular group, generally, the probationers did not come back as frequently because a parole officer can remand you, take you back into prison directly, whereas a probation officer will issue a warrant for your arrest if you're in violation. Parole is generally stricter and probation is generally looser. And I think that tension that Shyla is bringing up between the desire to rehabilitate as part of the criminal justice system and this desire to punish, you know, as part of the criminal justice system, which are both in there, is really fascinating, and you see that rehabilitation aspect play out.
And people can see it tonight. 2 million in prison, 4 million people on parole or probation. Matt O'Neill, Director of Life on Parole, documentary by Frontline with the New York Times. Shyla Dewan is the criminal justice editor at the New York Times. You can go to democracynow.org to see all the links. 10 o'clock tonight in your local area on PBS. That's that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Nermeen Sheikh, Dina Guzder. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.